Good afternoon, everyone. We are the reporters of Lesson 9. In this video, we are going to discuss about the 7-step model of moral reasoning of Scott Ray.
But before that, let me read first the learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, the students are expected to identify the 7-step model of moral reasoning, understand the different step model of moral reasoning, and lastly, to apply the 7-step model of moral reasoning in decision making.
Okay, now let's proceed to the introduction. Scott Ray's model for moral reasoning presents a 7-step approach to moral analysis and evaluation. It is oriented towards virtues and principles with consideration of consequences as a supporting rule. This model is free from cultural, ethnic, religious background, and biases, though it is consistent or uses biblical principles. Okay, so now, what is moral reasoning? Moral reasoning is the study of how people or individuals think about right and wrong and how they acquire and apply moral rules in decision making or in a particular situation. Moral reasoning are challenging because there are usually a good reasons for and against both choices. Example of moral reasoning is one could argue that it is okay to kill one person if it would save 5 because more people would be saved. But killing itself is immoral. So based on the example, we should need to consider both sides if our choices cannot affect the moral rules.
And here's the Scott Ray 7-step model of moral reasoning. Number 1, gather the fact. Number 2, determine the social issues. Number 3, determine what virtues or principle have a bearing on the case. Number 4, list the alternative. Number 5, compare the alternatives with the virtues or principles. Number 6, consider the consequences. Number 7, make a decision.
These are the steps of moral reasoning that we need to follow. The first step is gather the facts. The simplest way of clarifying an ethical dilemma is to make sure that the facts are clear. It is essential that in moral decision making, one has to know the general facts of the moral situation before coming up with a moral analysis or an evaluation. Some moral dilemmas can be resolved just by clarifying facts of the case in question, but in more complex cases, gathering the facts is the indispensable first step before any ethical analysis and reflection of the case. The second step is determine the social issues. Ethical interests are stated in terms of legitimate competing interests or goods. The competing interests are what creates the dilemma. So moral values and virtues must support the competing interest in order for an ethical dilemma to exist. If you cannot identify the underlying values or virtues, then you don't have an ethical dilemma. Usually, people hold this possession strongly and with passion because of the value or virtue beneath them. The moral issues should be correctly stated in terms of competing interests. It is this conflicting interests that practically make for a moral dilemma. So we should need to know the issues. The third step is determine what virtues or principles have bearing on the case. In an ethical dilemma, certain values and principles are central to the competing possessions. Determine if some should be given more weight than others. Ask what source for the principles is, whether it is from the Constitution, culture, natural law, religious, or from tradition. So in any moral dilemma, There are sure moral values or principles that are vital to the rival possessions being taken. It is very significant to recognize these principles and in some cases to decide whether some principles are to be weighted more heavily than others.
In these steps, it involves identifying all possible courses of action that can be taken in a given situation. These steps require a comprehensive exploration of the available option, considering both immediate and long-term choices. For example, if faced with a normal dilemma in the workplace, the individual might consider alternatives such as reporting an ethical violation, confronting the involved parties directly seeking guidance from a supervisor, or seeking external counsel. By listing the alternatives, the individual can gain a clearer understanding of available choices and a set of groundwork for the subsequent steps of evaluating this alternative against ethical principle and considering their potential consequences. This process enables a thorough and systematic approach to ethical decision making. In these steps, it involves evaluating each alternative course of action against the ethical values and principles. These steps is crucial in determining which option align with moral standard and which do not. To begin these steps, the individual must first identify the virtues and principles that are relevant to the situation. For example of ethical principles include honesty, fairness, respect for others, and responsibility. Virtues may include courage, justice, compassion, and integrity. Once these principles and virtues have been identified, the individual can evaluate each alternative course of action based on how well it aligns with them. For example, if honesty is a relevant principle, the individual would assess whether each alternative involves being truthful or not. These steps also involve considering the potential conflict between different virtues or principles. For example, if honesty conflicts with the principle of preserving confidentiality, the individual would need to weigh the importance of each principles and determine which one should take precedence. Overall, the purpose of the steps is to ensure that the chosen course of action aligns with ethical principles and values, and promote the greatest overall good while minimizing harm. In considering the consequences in the step model of moral reasoning involves evaluating the potential outcomes of each alternative and assessing the impact they would have on stakeholders. These steps require a thorough analysis of short-term and long-term effects of each possible course of action. It also involves taking into account the well-being and rights of all individuals or groups who may be affected by the decision. The evaluation of consequences should encompass both positive and negative outcomes, including any potential risk or harm that may result from the chosen course of action. Additionally, the consideration of consequences should be guided by ethical principles and values, aiming to uphold the fairness, justice, and welfare of all those involved. Ultimately, the assessment of consequences plays a crucial role in decision-making process, as it helps to ensure that the chosen course of action align with ethical standard and to promote the greatest overall good while minimizing the harm. In these steps, the decision should be based on a careful consideration of all available information and commitment to act ethically. When making the decision, it is important to take into account the implication of each alternative and how they align with moral values and ethical principles. The decision-making process should involve a thorough analysis of potential outcomes and the impact of all relevant stakeholders. Additionally, The decision should be made with a clear understanding of the individual's own ethical values and a commitment to act in accordance with them. The decision-making step in the model of moral reasoning requires a thoughtful and principled approach to choosing the most ethical course of action based on the evaluation of alternatives and their consequences.